ranking all 14 canon winners of Total Drama based on how impressive they are as players in the grand scheme of the franchise. I think it'll be something captivating to dive into where each winner ranks on the list. What's up guys, it's Willie. In today's video, I thought it'd be interesting to dive into a ranking of every Total Drama winner based on the kind of player they are, which to understand that criteria here, my assessment is on how well they would perform on most given appearances, which to be fair, it is a pretty high variance as this is a scripted material, but I'll try to be at least semi-accurate to rank them based on their ability to play collectively, not by winning game because that would be a different list. And I'll fully disclose that I will not be including the Redonkulous race winners because it's a whole different game, so let's all sit back and get to the ranking. So rank at the bottom, I think I'm going to have Lightning, where he is among one of the winners that have a very mediocre average placement, even though there is someone that has one that's lower than him. But generally, I think he's just worse on his own right, where on his first season, while do give him some credit for someone insulating himself in a majority and surviving round after round, especially in his dwindling team, he also has this big ego that just easily rubs others the wrong way about him. And around his end stretch, he was left in a very wonky situation where he'd be in a spot where he's just grasping for straws or any semblance of immunity to try and scrape on by. And I'll definitely say his final 4 round definitely left questionable, where I'm not 100% how the votes went down, but if I were in his spot, he should definitely been trying to work with Scott to try and knock out Zoey, because she and Cameron are basically a close duo at that point. And if he successfully did so, he would have been at least given a lot more of a better position to be taken to the end, while in the spot where Scott was eventually knocked out, which I don't think he had a hand in, he still ended up being in a position where he had to get lucky that the final challenge went the way intended for his sake, so he can guarantee his spot at the end. And even in the final 2, he absolutely has nobody who's rooting for him to win. And if the winner formula was based on a situation like Total Drama Action, he would lose to a jury vote. But by Total Drama standards, it's based around competition. So by the end of it, I do think his win comes off as a bit of a fluke, and especially how lucky he gets at certain points. And what is the biggest egregious of them all is his All-Stars run, which was such a disaster, as despite his ego, he's a very strong and a skilled competitor, but he just actively self-sabotages himself that causes him to be the first person voted out of his team, which to be fair, he does have that finalist stigma that can play a factor into why he would get targeted. But still, I think the intricacies surrounding his boot was not even through that means, and so it does cement to me that Lightning on any given season is just not long for the game. And so with that, Lightning's game was definitely a jumbled mess, and although I'll credit him and give him some merits, he still not was able to translate that to social ability. That is the big thing that he's lacking, that became his detriment in his second run. Next on the ranking, I have Beth, which okay, don't get me wrong, I did label her as the best player on Total Drama Action, but taking into her as a player in general, she's obviously not like the most elite in the world either. So to talk about Beth, while I believe she does have the lowest average of a winner, it's also in the spot where she's a part of a bigger cast than most recent seasons, so I think that's something to easily gloss over. But as a player, I mean, she's one that I do think has the right skill set socially when it comes to building bonds that keep her in for the game that long. Like in Island, the fact that Heather was willing to pull her in an alliance with Lindsay, where they would end up dominating a couple of the votes on her team, does speak to a lot about how well Beth was really insulated, and the same thing does apply for Action too. However, the one main problem that I can have with Beth is that while she does have the gusto to make a move, especially when needed, I just think she just does it in the most unsuccessful way. Like in Island, when she finally turns on Heather, looking back, it was not really the right time to do so, especially that early in the game, and also she didn't have like true built-in allies to really get the numbers stacked against Heather. And then in the following round where she would go home because her team believes she cursed them, and this is a spot where if Beth may have maintained her loyalty to Heather, I didn't do it in the semblance of a chance for Heather to try and vouch for her to stay, especially needing her as an ally. But because she did what she did, Heather has no problem of letting her get the boot. And as a player in Action, while the show does portray her as a background character, I think from what we saw, she just kind of continues the shtick of her game of just playing up this good social game, where there wasn't really a time that she's actively targeted, which does lead to how she gets to the end and end up winning. But even then, she's not really as influential or has some sort of agency in the game to really have a true move of her own. And also, like I said, she just continues to have the trope of her just being unsuccessful at stuff, like her trying to get Duncan out at the final 6, even though technically I will say she was going to be successful, but Lindsay made a mistake voting for herself. So in ways, I would say Beth was more unfortunate in that spot, but it still highlights how Beth just has so many things going wrong with her when she has that gusto to get something done that's right for her. So while she is above Lightning because she doesn't need to be lenient on game mechanics, she still doesn't really inherit this strategic mind or some agency that would make her player reputation a lot more to the savvy level. And honestly, if this wasn't a ranking based on her winning games, she would be relatively high, but as a player compared to everyone else, she's just not comparable. So that's where I land with Beth. Right at 12, I'm gonna have Gwen, where she's a pretty loose player when you assess her across her 4 seasons, which Island I guess can say is her best because she obviously won, but truthfully, her gameplay that season wasn't even as big as it could have been, as she was very neglectful with relationships, not really building any sort of social bond, and just isolating herself at points. And while she wasn't really targeted, I will say she definitely was benefited by a lot of things that were not in her control, especially with some dumb twists that were implemented in her winning season. But then getting to her future appearances, action, she was not that great. Obviously, a lot of what went wrong for her stemmed from Trent, but even then, her actions led to her own close friends turning against her. And then the same thing for World Tour, where she at least is starting to build up more social bonds, something that she didn't do in Island. But once again, she actively would self-sabotage that, especially with her relationship with Courtney, that led to her demise. And then All-Stars, where I wouldn't put too much fault to her elimination, but then again, even if it was in a standard vote, don't believe she was going to make it to the end. So in no way she was in any position to have those players be willing to take her to the end. And I think that's the biggest detriment to who Gwen is as a player, where I can credit her for at least trying to go on the untraveled avenues that she didn't take on her first season, but mishandles them in a lot of ways where she's either self-sabotaging herself or just leaving her in a position where no one is willing to take her to the end. And also, her level of agency is not really that great either, where I can say she has a tad bit, especially on her latest appearances, but then again, it's not really much as she's going along with what the consensus was anyway. So with that, I don't really have much faith in Gwen as a player in the grand scheme of total drama, and that's what ends up leaving her pretty low on the ranking here. Number 11, we're already wrapping up the TDI finalists with Owen. Now, on paper, Owen should be a better player because unlike Gwen, he is more socially adept and is a likable presence in the game. Not that I like him as a TV character, but still, he does have some strong suits from a likability front. However, even on his winning season, it's not particularly flawless, as there was times that people like Heather were willing to put his name out there. Like, he wasn't someone who was well situated despite his decent social game. And honestly, as a whole, he's also a loose player, especially on the strategic side, where I don't really think he has that bone of strategy in him to build some agency in the game. Like, even in Final 3, it's portrayed in a way where he didn't even care about trying to get Heather out until Gwen, which I can credit to her, convinces him to game that Final 3 challenge against Heather, which I think does highlight his lack of a strategic mind, because you should be getting Heather out in that spot, especially with the strong game she plays strategically and physically. And then we get to his other appearances, where despite his likability, he still ends up finding himself in a situation where players are just willing to let him go, especially recognizing how big of a threat that his social game imposes. Like, in general, he's not utilizing his social bonds in a proper sense to create an easy path for him to get to the end, where that's intertwined with his lack of a strategic bone that further represents the flaws of him as a player. And there's really not much I can go further on, as even if he's trying to approach an under-the-radar game, it's not impressive in the world either. So this is the placement I think is warranted for Owen. Then at 10, I have to have Skye, which I know might not be the most popular take, especially since I would rather Skye win over Shawn, but truthfully, because she and her fellow finalists only played once, it does have me have a limited assessment on her as a player. So to gauge everything off by her single season appearance, she's a fine middling player, does have some social acumen to her, building some strong bonds, especially with the more stronger players like Jasmine, and hey, even having a hectic, somewhat romantic relationship with Dave, which whatever. But I think the most complicating thing as her player is her positioning at points where we have that merge round where she nearly goes home if Dave didn't sacrifice his spot, which if it wasn't total drama being total drama, voting yourself wouldn't even be allowed. But honestly, it leads to another situation where she is very luck based, especially in rounds where she is primed to be booted. I mean, from the final 4 onward, she's in a spot where there's an obvious duo in Shawn and Jasmine, and then there's Sugar, who she shouldn't even waste her breath on, as Sugar has no intentions to connect with her. So basically, she's kind of screwed if things don't go right in that round. But because of the dumb formatting with just challenges determining the final 2, it leads to her pulling out on top to get herself in the finale where she would ultimately win, which yes, at times she's going to be very well liked, but then at points she may self-sabotage herself, which would cause some people to turn against her. And also, she's kind of in a situation where there's going to be people who are going to be wanting her out. So generally speaking, Skye is a middling player in that, like, finding her somewhat decent social bonds that she utilizes way more better than Owen gives me enough of the confidence to rank her in this spot at number 10. Next to number 9, and we're already getting to the other player who's only played once, which is obviously Shawn. And as a whole, his game is just similar to Skye's, but just better with his positioning, where I don't really recall where he was in true danger, or at least a contender to almost getting voted out. So all of that already gives enough to put him above Skye as a player, where his social game is well built in too, where he has a really close relationship with Jasmine, and does pretty much take him to the end of the game. And even in the spot where he lost her, if the round played out like a normal vote, he's guaranteed final 2. like Sky and Sugar were gonna take each other out. So what is really holding him back in this ranking is that when comparing him to the rest of the winners on the list who's had multiple appearances, it just makes gauging off him as a player a lot more marginalized. And even then, despite his strong social game, I think there's a part of me that believes he doesn't really have a like killer instinct, as Jasmine played one heck of a game too, and I don't know if there was a point where Shawn would recognize the threat that she is and would try to cut her at the end. Like, that's some things I have a lot of reservations with, is how much gumption he has to make a more self-interested move that'll guarantee his win. Like, a lot of that is up in the air because, to iterate, he's only played once. And generally speaking, these one-time players does make my assessment on them as players a tad complicated, so if only basing around their runs on their one individual season, it just makes the ranking a bit difficult on where exactly is right to place them. So I decided the middle is perfect enough to place both of them back to back, and with Shawn just being the better player of the two, that's where I would end up landing him here. So then at number 8, I have Mike. And this is a rocky case, especially with his All-Stars run, but as a player in general, he's just fine for the most part. I mean, very well liked, and has a strong established relationship with Zoey, who is equally a good player, which does become very beneficial to him as he's able to have this strong bond with someone who's able to guarantee them to the end game. And I won't put too much fault on him for how he went out, because Scott had the power to literally decide who goes, and yeah, pretty much he just got duped by that, especially with the circumstances leading up to it. And then this is where we get to his second run, where it's a wild case because he's not physically in the game for the 2/3 of it, because Mal ends up taking over and impersonating him. And while I do give credit to Mal for even being successful, which voided any sort of target on his back, it's still not Mike, despite me being confident Mike would be able to replicate Mal's impersonation of him. And while I will give Mike the credit that his strong relationship with Zoey kept her to stay loyal to him even if his evil counterpart was physically present, so there's a lot of strong merits to his social and romantic bond with Zoey that kept him locked safe. So likewise, good socially, and strategically, he's just okay, but most of the decision making comes from Zoey's end. We'll talk about soon in the ranking, but because of the insanity with Mal's takeover, it does complicate a lot of how I view Mike as a player. So with all that said, he's fine enough, and I think this is a believable and okayish spot to place him in. At number 7, this may not be a popular opinion that he's this high, but I think Wayne is a decent all-around player. Like, yeah, he's not like the most game-savvy, influential, or harnessing any sort of dominant gameplay, but I give a lot of pros to his solid positioning in the game, where despite him being in such a clear-cut duo with Raj, where they're like the Katie and Sadies in the world, but just better players, Wayne is just able to outlast his fellow campers because he's perfectly insulated in the majority, where I won't even recall a time where he's actively having his name thrown out as a clear target. And likewise, circumstances surrounding his only ever elimination where he was just evacuated, so there wasn't really any sort of idea what would happen if he wasn't sent home that way. But from how well he performed in season 2, it gives you confidence that he would have been someone who probably reached around the end game because he has these very strong social bonds. And while I don't know how intentional he was in having these big targets in front of him like MK and Julia to use them as like shields and stuff, he still ended up following through with that kind of maneuver where no one looked at him as a primary target. And his likability is like off the charts, where he's got like a majority grouping of those who are rooting for him to win. So I think this warrants Wayne this part on the ranking, where I don't put him much more higher because I think the strategic elements is something that he doesn't seem as intentional with, which, hey, this is kind of similar to like Owen. But I think Wayne has just better upsides and actually has better management with his bonds than Owen, who does often get his name tossed around. At number 6, I have Cameron, the player who makes a great example of how brains is better than brawn, and although it doesn't poetically culminate this ranking, it's still an aspect where he's ranked relatively high, and that does stem from him being a player who has a lot of social acumen, and is pretty well liked by the cast. I mean, in contrast to Lightning, he literally had almost the entire cast rooting for him to win, and that does speak to a lot about how well he built his reputation. And in All-Stars, he was never truly voted out at all, he was just evacuated due to his injuries. But yeah, like I said, his social prowess is strong. Now, the thing that does partially deteriorate him in this ranking is that he's kind of the player that is willing to let his sword down, as you saw that he did that twice across his 2 seasons. And yet when he attempts to do though, the opposite effect happens and it ends up working out for him. Like him coming off as this like nerdy sort of figure that fueled Lightning's ego to believe that he would be an easy beat to the end is such a complex reason for him to select Cam over Zoey. And to be fair, I do think I would have had Cameron a lot more higher if he was aware of this sort of perception that he's getting and having more intention to play that up. So it could try and fuel players to wanting to take him to the end under the impression that they would beat him. So it would have been more astounding if that was something that he could have approached with. And from a strategical lens, he's pretty alright. He does make the right calls on who to take out, especially in the end game, like threats like Joe and Scott. Like, he has these strong maneuvers and he does have the right intentions. I just think for the most part, when things go awry for him in the game, he just attempts to give up on that spot. And usually that is a fundamental issue with a player where they're not really able to handle their adversity in the most optimal way. And the fact that Cameron doesn't seem to like put up a fight or try in some way is what lowers my thoughts on him as a player, even though he has a lot of the strong suits for him for how he played across his 2 seasons. At number 5, I'm surprisingly having Zoey, which she's well known to have the highest average of any multi-time player from Total Drama, so that's an impressive feat. But generally, to talk about her game, I mean, it mostly revolves around her strong bond with Mike that was beneficial to getting her pretty far on both her seasons. But we cannot take away from the fact that she also had some really well built-in alliances, basically having this somewhat power structure surrounding her, and she does make some strong strategic maneuvers throughout her games, making probably the most ideal moves as she can. Now, to be fair, she does have that flaw where she kind of makes herself too blatant of a threat. I mean, physically wise, she's well skilled, and with Lightning kind of seeing right through that is what also led to him wanting to basically snipe her out at the final 3. So I'll give a tad knock against her on that end. And then in All-Stars, while she was playing very well, continuously having strong social bonds that have helped her navigate through the season, there's a point around, I could say, the final 5 where I feel like her positioning was starting to crumble, and she only basically had Mal, who she frustratingly had to gravitate to because of all the weird shenanigans. But then again, I think that she played out a few of her rounds a bit too passively, and I think that's kind of the fundamental issue with Zoey, where she's well adaptable in the game, but her level of gameplay is not really going to like the deadly level that could ultimately be beneficial to her to inherit the savvy nature in her. And also, at the same time, she's another person that tends to get very unlucky. Like, taking back to Revenge of the Island, the way she lost Mike was unfortunate, but also in the spot where she went home when she and Cameron were so close to becoming the final 2 was just an unfortunate tragedy to her game. And then with All-Stars, with Mike not being able to be physically present and her slowly losing allies that are out of her control is just purely an highlight to how much misfortune is going on around her, to which it would have been more beneficial to her if all of these things didn't happen. But I'll say, I will knock against how she handled adversity in a passive way. But you know what, in my personal criteria, passiveness is still more preferable than forfeiting gameplay, and her making it to the final 3 twice in her season is by far impressive enough to boost her highly on this ranking. So then at 4, I have Duncan, who's kind of in a similar mold with Zoey, where he makes it to the end game like 3 out of the 4 times he played, and even on his worst run, he wasn't even voted out. And this ranking onwards from now is where he lists players who set the bar of players who try to play in a more dominant style, and Duncan's among those in that vein, but probably suffers from more fatal flaws than the others. So to talk about him, he's a well strategically minded player, and we see him demonstrate that across his seasons. Like on Island, when he started seeing how the numbers dwindle upon him, he was the one to formulate this all-guy alliance that, to be fair, didn't last long because he mishandled a lot of his relationships with them, which caused the alliance to eventually leak by the end. But still, seeing how active he was to become in this dominant position shows the instincts he has. And talk about instincts, let's get to action, where it's kind of mixed back how everything went down, but the fact that he voted out Courtney, especially with the strong game she played, does, I guess, show his killer instincts in the game, especially if you're going to try and play self-interestedly. Now, to be fair, he's another one that is kind of luck-based and gets benefited by a lot of things that are not in his control. Plus, also, socially, he's a bit of a mess. Like, obviously, having this criminal background, it does lead to him playing up this mean-spirited side of him, where he does really poorly treat a lot of players, to which it does lead to him getting a bullseye on his back. Like, in TDI, he barely scraped on by in that one round against Bridget. In action, he lucked out when Lindsay accidentally voted herself, where he legitimately was supposed to go home that round. And then when World Tour, where he's about to go home in Greece, he gets saved by a last-minute non-elimination by Chris, which is pretty egregious. Like, truthfully speaking, despite his dominant style of gameplay, each season he has some sort of luck that ends up sparing him in rounds where he would have been going home. Where, I mean, to be fair, Total Drama Island is more impressive how he scraped on by. The other 2 I talked about is definitely the most appalling to him as a player, and even then, most times don't really work in his favor. So while there is some impressive maneuvers from Duncan's end, I still believe this barrage of luck-based circumstances that he's been getting in each of his seasons just knock him down to the bottom of this dominant tier of players. Ranked at 3 is shockingly Heather. Now, I love Heather, and this was a more biased ranking. I would have her at number 1, but as a player, she's not the most consistent in the world to at least crack the top 2 spot. However, it won't take away the fact that she fundamentally is a deadly player. I mean, both her Island and World Tour runs reflect on her prowess in the game, not only strategically, but also physically as well, where she displays this overt manipulative strategy that would end up plotting a lot of the demises of many players. And though I'll say I'll falter at times that things benefited to her even though she didn't have much contribution to it, but the one major thing that is truly the biggest problem with Heather is that her social navigation is very lopsided, blended with the fact that on most given appearances it's going to be a rocky run for her because she has that reputation based from Island, so it automatically establishes a sentiment for future players to be more wary of her gameplay as they are aware of how she can really plot those schemes. Like in general, Heather's a player that while she is the most powerful with her strategic mind and is fortunate to get her weights in most times, she is also a player that is always going to find some tiff with others and is just not poised to be in the best spot in most given seasons. And in comparison to the other two, they have the similar skill sets to her, but is just better positioned on any given season. So it's self-explanatory what that means for her, so that's what leaves her here at number 3. And at rank number 2, we're gonna have Priya, where she's another one that is a pretty strategically astounded player. Although not avert or at least as aggressive as Heather, she still makes the right calls at most given points and is able to use the right strategy to navigate and maneuver her way throughout the game. Plus also, unlike Heather, who's not the greatest with managing her threat level on a given season, Priya is on a contrary to that, as despite the winner persona that she's inherited, she still manages to handle that sentiment to the best of her ability to build bonds with others who are willing to take her far. Thus, is also a reason that in Reboot Season 2, she was supposed to be in the finale, but she got severely unlucky that Julia got her hands on an idol that has some rocky circumstances surrounding it, but still, Priya, a previous finalist, was about to be a finalist again and only got sniped out due to a last-minute idol play. So because of that, it really just props her up as a player even more in the fact that she had that path to make it to the end twice, where it seemed like no one was willing to take her out, especially on her first season. Her second one, her position was a little more loose, but obviously because she had that winner's stigma, but it still followed up with her being able to overcome the struggles she faced. Like overall, a very solid player with very impressive maneuvers. Now what makes her miss out on being the number 1 spot is that her level of domination is not particularly the most strongest in the world. While she's a player that isn't really lenient on like advantages or invincibility, there is some missteps with her control in the game, even to the point where she kind of lets her foot off the gas pedal, which isn't really great when it comes to how I assess you as a player. So because of those factors, it does warrant her to be in the penultimate spot of the ranking. Like summarizing everything as a whole, she's perfectly skilled, both socially, physically, and level-headed strategically, but just not to the extreme. And I think her fundamental error is how her level of control essentially peters out by the end. Then at rank number 1, we have Alejandro. Which, I mean, is he the most perfect player in the world? No, he's not completely flawless. However, his level of strategy is like on the upper echelon. Like, he manages his social plays and strategic mind to a further extreme, with how well he's really able to charm players to follow through with moves that best works for him. And also on World Tour, his handling on his relationship with Heather was pretty interesting from a gameplay front, where despite Heather actively wanting him gone, but her essentially mirroring him on a gameplay level and also having some sort of romantic connection to him, it does gain him a strong traction in the game to excel his positioning a lot more when he is such a blatant force that needs to be cut at the end. Also, his tactics in the game comes with a lot of the more psychological qualities in them, which Al uses that sort of element to the best of his charm. Like for me, I think Al easily plays the most dominant style of game and pretty much knows the optimal strategic maneuvers to ensure that his game continues following it. And while I will admit he does have his missteps and even almost getting voted out at the Final Four in World Tour, he still demonstrated his efficiency with his plotting skills. And while All-Stars, he did not demonstrate as sufficient of a game, plus also needing an idol that he literally stole from Heather to save himself, I wouldn't hold too much against him because he has that reputation in him. Plus also, he was able to scrape on by a couple rounds, so I'll give him that. But easily the most well-rounded and aggressive player that has won Total Drama. So that's what leaves him as the definitive best player on this list. So with that, that's my list, ranking every Total Drama winner based on how they are as players in the grand scheme of the game. So feel free to share what you think of my ranking, and if you're inclined to see more content like this, tap that like and tap subscribe. And with all that, I appreciate you guys tuning in.